A 74-year-old woman brought three bear cubs home to raise, but after a while their actions scared everyone. Welcome back to the next story of Animal Dreams Story. Subscribe to the channel and start an interesting story right away. In the biting winter of 2019, Zelda, a 74-year-old widow, lived alone in a remote house. Her days were quiet, filled with the rhythm of survival, collecting firewood, tending to her small vegetable patch, and staving off the harsh loneliness of isolation. Her only companions were the whispers of the wind and sounds of wild animals. One fateful day, while going deep into the forest to collect firewood, Zelda's attention was drawn to faint, distressed cries carried by the wind. Following the sound, she stumbled upon a heart-wrenching scene. A wounded mother bear lay motionless in the snow, her once mighty frame covered in scars from a desperate battle. Three cubs huddled, their tiny bodies trembling and their mewling cries barely audible above the cold gusts. Zelda's heart broke at the sight. Approaching cautiously, Zelda kept her axe in hand, unsure of how the injured bear might react. But the mother bear, still clinging to life, lifted her head weakly and locked eyes with Zelda. In those dark, pain-filled eyes, Zelda saw something she would never forget, a plea, almost human in its desperation. It was as though the mother bear was begging her to save the cubs. Zelda knelt in the snow. The mother bear's labored breaths grew weaker, and with a final exhale, she rested her head and moved no more. Zelda, overwhelmed by grief, turned to the cubs. They were too young to fend for themselves, and leaving them would mean certain death in the unforgiving cold. Despite the danger, she removed her thick coat, wrapping it around the cubs one by one, and held them close to her chest. The trek back to her house was arduous, the cubs' soft whimpers urging her forward despite the biting wind. By the time she reached her doorstep, Zelda's arms were numb, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Inside the house, Zelda lit a fire to warm the cubs. She boiled water to heat blankets, feeding them milk with a makeshift bottle fashioned from an old glass jar. She named them Boris, Roger, and Joyce, drawing inspiration from the stories her late husband used to tell her about strong, enduring characters. For months, Zelda became their surrogate mother. Her small house turned into a bustling den, filled with the playful chaos of three growing cubs. They knocked over firewood stacks, chewed on her boots, and nuzzled her for warmth at night. Despite their mischief, Zelda marveled at their intelligence and individuality. Boris, the adventurous leader, Roger, the cautious observer, and Joyce, the curious. Caring for the cubs was not without challenges. Zelda learned to balance their wild instincts with her efforts to keep them alive. She taught them to forage for food by scattering berries and nuts across the snowy yard, watching as they clumsily learned to use their paws. When a late winter snowstorm hit, Zelda stayed awake all night, feeding the cubs and ensuring they stayed warm. Word spread among the sparse wilderness community about the widow with three bear cubs. Some called her brave, others foolish. Zelda ignored the skeptics, her bond with the cubs growing stronger with each passing day. In their playful growls and soft nuzzles, Zelda found a joy she hadn't felt since her husband passed away. The cubs became her family, filling her quiet existence with life and purpose. When spring finally arrived, Zelda knew the time had come to let them go. She led them deep into the forest, her steps heavy with reluctance. The cubs hesitated, turning back to her with confused eyes, but she urged them forward. "You belong out here," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Be strong, my little ones." As they disappeared into the trees, Zelda stood motionless, the forest around her silent and still. In the months she had cared for them, the cubs had not only survived, but transformed her life, reminding her of the strength found in love and compassion. In the winter of 2021, Zelda's resilience was tested once more. A deadly blizzard descended upon the wilderness, burying the land in thick layers of snow and cutting off her access to vital supplies. Days passed, the howling wind battering her small house and making even the simplest tasks, like fetching water from the nearby stream, nearly impossible. Despite her experience with harsh winters, this storm was unlike anything Zelda had ever faced. On the fourth day of the storm, Zelda, realizing her firewood was nearly depleted, decided to venture out to collect more. She bundled herself tightly, pulling on her thickest coat and boots, and braved the icy winds. The snow was blinding, swirling in chaotic gusts that made every step treacherous. Her footprints were quickly erased by the relentless storm, leaving her disoriented in the vast white wilderness. As the hours dragged on, Zelda's strength began to wane. The biting cold seeped through her clothes, and her hands, clutching an axe and rope, grew numb. Her breath came in shallow gasps, visible in the freezing air, as exhaustion overtook her. Struggling to find her way back, Zelda collapsed against a snowdrift, her vision blurring. The storm's ferocity dulled her senses, and she felt the creeping onset of hypothermia. Just as she was on the verge of succumbing to the cold, Zelda felt something warm against her cheek. A soft breath, steady and comforting. She opened her eyes to see three massive figures standing over her, their fur dusted with snow. Boris, Roger, and Joyce, now fully grown and magnificent, had found her. Their presence felt like a miracle. Zelda's lips trembled as she whispered their names, tears freezing on her cheeks. The bears worked together with an intelligence and determination that defied explanation. Boris gently nudged her shoulder, urging her to rise, while Roger and Joyce pressed their warm bodies against her, shielding her from the worst of the wind. When Zelda stumbled, too weak to continue, Boris crouched low, allowing her to lean against his side. Slowly, the bears guided her through the storm, their large paws forging a path through the snow. As they neared her house, Zelda could barely stand, her legs trembling with fatigue. Joyce moved to support her other side, ensuring she didn't fall. When they finally reached her home, the bears didn't stop. They circled the house, checking for weak points where the snow might breach the walls, and stood guard, their massive bodies forming a barrier against the blizzard. Roger pressed her broad back against the door, shielding it from the wind's icy claws. Inside, Zelda managed to light a fire with her remaining strength, her hands shaking as she warmed herself by the flames. Through the frosted window, she could see the silhouettes of the bears, huddled together, their watchful eyes scanning the storm. For hours, they stood vigil, ensuring no harm would come to her. When the blizzard finally subsided the following morning, Zelda opened the door to find the bears still there, their fur glistening with frost but their eyes bright and alert. She stepped outside, weak but filled with gratitude, and placed her hands on Boris's broad head. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "My sweet, brave cubs. You saved me." Boris let out a soft rumble, almost like a purr, as if to acknowledge her words. Roger nuzzled her shoulder, while Joyce sniffed at her coat, ensuring she was unharmed. The trio lingered for a while. Their presence is a reminder of gratitude. As they finally turned to leave, disappearing into the snow-covered forest, Zelda stood in awe. Later that spring, Zelda's tranquil existence was suddenly disrupted by an ominous presence in the forest. She had stepped out of her house to gather herbs from her garden when she caught sight of a tiger prowling at the edge of the clearing. Its amber eyes locked onto her, and she froze, her heart pounding in terror. The tiger let out a low growl, inching closer, its sleek body tense with predatory intent. Panicked, Zelda screamed, her voice slicing through the stillness of the forest. The sound carried far, reverberating through the trees. The tiger paused, its ears flicking toward the direction of an approaching commotion. Before Zelda could retreat to the safety of her house, the ground seemed to tremble beneath her feet as Boris, Roger, and Joyce came thundering out of the forest like a force of nature. The three bears moved with astonishing speed and precision, their roars shattering the tense silence. Boris took the lead, rearing up on his hind legs to appear even more imposing, while Roger and Joyce flanked him, their growls deep and menacing. The tiger, startled by the sudden arrival of the massive trio, hesitated, its predatory focus faltering. The bears didn't stop at intimidation. With a calculated charge, they spread out, herding the tiger away from Zelda and toward the edge of the forest. Joyce swiped at the ground near the tiger, kicking up dirt and leaves, while Roger blocked its retreat, roaring fiercely. Boris moved with deliberate steps, ensuring the tiger had no choice but to back down. Their movements were coordinated, almost as if they were communicating silently, each bear playing a specific role in driving the predator away. Zelda watched in awe, clutching the porch railing as her protectors demonstrated both their strength and their remarkable intelligence. The tiger, clearly outmatched, growled one last time before turning and bolting into the trees. Even then, the bears didn't relent immediately. They pursued the predator for several hundred yards, ensuring it wouldn't return, before circling back toward Zelda's cabin. When they reappeared, their demeanor had shifted. The tension in their bodies eased, and they approached Zelda with calm confidence. Boris walked up to her, his dark eyes searching hers as if to ensure she was unharmed. Roger sniffed the air around the house, checking for lingering threats, while Joyce padded to the edge of the clearing, sitting like a sentry with his gaze fixed on the forest. Zelda stepped down from her porch cautiously, her voice trembling with emotion as she spoke. "You saved me again," she said, her hand resting on Boris's massive shoulder. Roger rumbled softly, a sound that seemed almost like reassurance, while Joyce let out a low, satisfied grunt. The bears remained near her house for the rest of the day. Their presence is protection and sharing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Zelda found herself reflecting on the incredible loyalty and intelligence her Ursine companions had shown. She knew that while she had once saved their lives, they had more than repaid the debt, and in doing so, they had become her guardians, her family, and her enduring connection to the wild. In 2023, Zelda's peaceful life was disrupted when the sound of roaring chainsaws and heavy machinery echoed through the forest. Illegal loggers had arrived, intent on cutting down the trees that surrounded her property, a vital habitat for countless wildlife and her sanctuary of solitude. Zelda confronted them, her voice firm despite her age. "You can't do this," she insisted. "This forest belongs to all of us, not just to be destroyed for profit." The loggers, dismissive and emboldened by their numbers, ignored her protests. One man laughed, revving his chainsaw as a show of power. Zelda, though trembling with anger and fear, stood her ground. But she was not alone. Unbeknownst to the loggers, Boris, Roger, and Joyce had been watching from the shadows of the trees. The moment one of the loggers advanced toward Zelda, the bears emerged with an earth-shaking presence. Boris led the charge, rearing up on his hind legs and letting out a roar that echoed through the forest like thunder. Roger and Joyce flanked him, their deep growls rumbling like an impending storm. The loggers froze in terror at the sight of the massive bears. One man dropped his chainsaw, its motor sputtering to silence. Another stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. Boris, showing remarkable restraint, swiped a paw at a chainsaw lying on the ground, sending it skidding across the dirt. Roger advanced toward a stack of equipment and with one powerful shove, toppled it like a tower of matchsticks. Joyce circled the group, his piercing gaze locking onto each man, his growls a clear warning. The bears' actions were not random chaos, but a calculated display of dominance. They didn't harm the loggers, but made it abundantly clear that the forest was under their protection. One logger, visibly shaking, muttered, "Let's get out of here!" The others quickly agreed, abandoning their tools and scrambling back to their trucks. As the last vehicle roared away, the bears relaxed, their growls subsiding. Boris ambled back to Zelda, his large head bowing slightly as if to check on her. Roger sniffed the abandoned equipment, ensuring there was no lingering threat, while Joyce positioned himself between Zelda and the retreating trucks, his body still alert. Zelda, overwhelmed with emotion, stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Boris's neck, her face buried in his thick fur. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She moved to Roger and Joyce, placing her hands on their massive shoulders in gratitude. "You saved not just me, but this forest." Over the following days, Zelda, with the help of local conservationists, reported the incident to authorities, ensuring the loggers wouldn't return. The story of the bears' intervention spread, drawing attention to the illegal logging practices and leading to increased protection for the forest. Zelda often found Boris, Roger, and Joyce patrolling the edge of her property, their presence a silent but powerful deterrent to anyone who might threaten the land. Their remarkable actions had preserved not just Zelda's home, but the thriving ecosystem she cherished, further solidifying the unbreakable bond between the widow and her extraordinary guardians. Later that year, wildfires raged through the region. Fueled by dry conditions and high winds, the sky turned an eerie orange, and the air was thick with acrid smoke. Zelda stood on her porch, staring in horror as the fire's glow drew closer. The crackling of flames and the distant roar of trees collapsing filled the air, and she realized she had little time to act. With no vehicle in the nearest town miles away, her options were grim. As Zelda scrambled to gather her most essential belongings, she heard familiar, heavy footfalls behind her. Turning, she saw Boris, Roger, and Joyce emerging from the smoke. They approached her with a sense of urgency, nudging her gently away from the house. Zelda grabbed her small pack and followed, coughing as the smoke thickened around her. The bears moved precisely, navigating through the chaotic terrain with a confidence that astounded her. They paused at dangerous sections, ensuring Zelda could keep up. And when she stumbled on a route hidden by ash, Roger stood beside her, offering support. Boris led the way, his nose in the air, detecting paths where the smoke was thinner, while Joyce trailed behind, watching for falling embers or shifting flames. As they reached a clearing that seemed far from the immediate danger, Zelda thought their rescue mission was over. But the bears had more to do. They turned and headed back toward her house, their massive forms disappearing into the haze. Zelda called after them, fear gripping her chest, but they didn't hesitate. What happened next was unbelievable. The bears began creating a fire break around the house. Boris and Joyce used their powerful paws to dig trenches, exposing damp soil that could halt the fire's spread. Roger trampled dry brush and branches near the house, clearing the area of fuel for the flames. They worked tirelessly, their movements coordinated as if they understood the urgency of their task. Meanwhile, Zelda stood in the clearing, her hands pressed to her heart as she watched in awe. A passing helicopter spotted her and sent rescuers her way. When the firefighters arrived, they were equally astonished by what they witnessed. The bears working to protect the house. "We've never seen anything like this," one firefighter murmured, his voice tinged with disbelief. Hours later, as the fire was finally contained, Zelda's house remained untouched, a lone structure standing amidst a scorched landscape. Firefighters and wildlife experts inspected the area, marveling at the firebreak the bears had created. "This is unprecedented," a researcher said, documenting the scene. "It's as if they knew exactly what to do." When the bears returned to Zelda's side, she threw her arms around Boris, tears streaming down her face. She hugged Roger and Joyce in turn, their fur singed, but their eyes calm and steady. The bond between Zelda and her bear family had deepened further, forged in the crucible of danger and survival. In the weeks that followed, the story of Zelda and her extraordinary protectors spread far and wide, drawing attention to the intelligence and emotional depth of wild animals. Zelda's cabin became a symbol of resilience, standing as a testament to the unbreakable bond she shared with the bears. Researchers flocked to the area, eager to study the unprecedented cooperation between a human and these remarkable creatures. But Zelda insisted on keeping her life and her connection with the bears as simple and pure as it had always been. After the fire, the bears established a protective perimeter around Zelda's property, patrolling the edges of the forest. Their behavior astounded researchers who had come to document this unprecedented relationship. Boris would stand on his hind legs to scan the area for threats, while Roger and Joyce worked in tandem, identifying which animals posed a risk and which were harmless wanderers. Occasionally, more significant threats loomed. One evening, a pack of wolves ventured too close to the house, their howls piercing the quiet night. Zelda, uneasy but trusting her guardians, stayed inside as Boris led the charge, flanked by Roger and Joyce. The standoff was brief. The wolves, recognizing the bears' dominance, retreated without conflict. When the trio returned, Boris pressed his nose against Zelda's window as if to reassure her, a moment that brought tears to her eyes. Zelda's story began to spread far and wide, capturing the imagination of people across the globe. Journalists arrived to document the widow and her extraordinary bond with the bears. Zelda, though reluctant at first, eventually welcomed the attention, using it as an opportunity to advocate for conservation and the importance of coexistence with wildlife. "These bears saved my life," she would say in interviews, "but it all started because I chose to save theirs." Conservationists and animal behaviorists were particularly intrigued. They set up motion-activated cameras to study the bears' interactions, capturing moments that defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. In one instance, footage showed Roger delicately removing branches that had fallen near Zelda's garden, seemingly understanding their obstruction to the plant's growth. Another clip captured Boris playfully tossing a log into a nearby stream, clearing a pathway that had been blocked. The bear's protective instincts extended beyond Zelda. A group of campers once wandered too close to her property, unaware of its proximity. The bears appeared, their size and presence intimidating but non-aggressive. The campers, startled but unharmed, left promptly, later recounting the surreal experience in awe. In the quiet moments, Zelda would sit on her porch, sipping tea and watching the bears roam the forest. Their once playful antics as cubs had matured into a calm, protective presence. Yet their connection to her remained unchanged. They were her family. One winter, Zelda fell ill with a fever that left her too weak to fetch wood for her fireplace. For days, Boris, Roger, and Joyce took turns bringing fallen branches and logs to her cabin, leaving them neatly stacked near her door. Zelda later told a journalist, "They didn't just save me. They knew exactly what I needed, even when I couldn't ask." A few years later, she began to prepare for the day when she might no longer be there to watch over the bears. She worked with conservationists to ensure the forest would remain a safe haven for them and the generations of wildlife to come. But even in her heart, she knew that Boris, Roger, and Joyce would always be more than guardians. They were her family, a bond forged in kindness that no time or distance could break. Her story, retold in countless ways across the world, reminded people that compassion could bridge even the widest gaps between species. And as the sun set on her wilderness home each evening, Zelda felt an unshakable certainty. Her simple act of empathy had not just saved three cubs, it had changed the world. Do you think love can bridge the gap between humans and animals? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and see you again.